After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Hitler declared war on the US on December 1941, the US formally entered World War II. At the same time, the collaborations between Joseph Stalin, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill began and continued all through the war. In 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill traveled to Iran for the Tehran Conference, codenamed the Eureka Conference. This was perhaps the most important of the Allied summits to date. It was the first of the strategic conferences with Stalin. After the Soviets had pushed out the Nazis out of Soviet territory, Stalin's primary focus was on securing Soviet borders and rebuilding the country after having suffered immense destruction. However, Roosevelt and Churchill wanted the Soviet forces to continue advancing westward to ensure the complete defeat of Nazi Germany. This was a key topic at conferences like the Teheran Conference and later the Yalta Conference in 1945. However, Stalin didn't need much convincing, since the idea of expanding Soviet influence into Eastern Europe was very appealing to him. Stalin was very suspicious of both Roosevelt and Churchill, but the one he had the hardest time trusting was Churchill. Stalin was well aware that Churchill hated communism and was a staunch imperialist. Also, it didn't help that Churchill had supported military intervention against the Bolsheviks during the revolution. Churchill's support included providing military aid such as weapons and reinforcements to the White Russian armies who were fighting against the revolution. Although the US did the same thing during that period, Roosevelt was deeply engaged in naval affairs. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson and had no direct role in US intervention in Russia. Stalin's suspicion was very clear during these meetings, as they were very cold towards each other. Stalin often believed that Churchill was trying to undermine Soviet interest, especially when it came to post-war Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill recognized that Stalin's mistrust could jeopardize their alliance, so they worked to build his confidence. Roosevelt often acted as a mediator between Churchill and Stalin, as he was seen as less antagonistic towards the Soviet Union.
Can I have Romania?
Sure.
Okay.
Can we jump on your belly?
Okay.
Boingy, 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 boingy.
Then Stalin wanted to jump on Churchill's belly.
Boingy, 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 boingy.
Also, Churchill was often dressed in custom-tailored suit, with a bow tie, pocket watch, and his iconic Homburg hat. Stalin, in contrast, tended to dress more simply, often in his military-style tunic, which reflected a more modest image. Roosevelt felt like he could use this to win over Stalin. He recognized that Stalin's mistrust of Churchill, partly due to Churchill's aristocratic demeanor and imperialistic policies, could be an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the US and the Soviet. Roosevelt often presented himself as more approachable and less ideologically rigid than Churchill, which helped him build trust with Stalin. Roosevelt refused to meet Churchill alone on the grounds that the Russians wouldn't like it. Yet at the same time he had several meetings with Stalin, which Churchill was excluded from. Churchill was astonished and hurt by this behavior. Churchill, faced with the decline of the British Empire and frustrated by his reduced status in the Allied coalition, fell into a state of depression, which is visible in the photos of him from the conference. But Roosevelt went even further. When after 3 days at Tehran he felt that he had not made as much progress with Stalin as he would have liked, he tried to win over Stalin by making fun of Churchill. US Secretary of Labor Frances Perkin recalled in her memoirs how Roosevelt had described the situation to her. Roosevelt had said, "I began almost as soon as we got into the conference room. I said, lifting my hand to cover a whisper, 'Winston is cranky this morning. He got up on the wrong side of the bed.' A vague smile passed over Stalin's eyes, and I detected I was on the right track. I began to tease Churchill about his Britishness, about John Bull, about his expensive cigars, and about his luxury habits. It began to register with Stalin. Winston got red and scolded, and the more he did, the more Stalin smiled. Finally, Stalin broke down in a deep, hearty chuckle, and for the first time in 3 days I saw light. I kept it up until Stalin was laughing with me, and it was then that I called him Uncle Joe. He would have thought me fresh the day before, but at that day he was laughing and came over and shook my hand." But Stalin of course knew what Roosevelt was doing, and he used this to his advantage. Here's how historian Stephen Coplin describes the situation.
Roosevelt was cultivating Stalin. He was under the illusion that he needed to win over Stalin's trust as opposed to Stalin's respect. He therefore attempted blatantly to make disparaging references to Churchill to ingratiate himself with Stalin. I don't think this affected the larger strategy very much because events on the ground were very decisive, but it was a curious moment. Stalin was sizing them up, and like anyone trained in Marxism-Leninism, he was looking for the contradictions, the tensions among the imperialists. So he would exploit any differences between Churchill and Roosevelt. He had good secret intelligence already on their positions from his agents, and he also had intuition, which was quite sophisticated. He charmed them at the same time as he played them off one against the other. I'm not sure, however, how much that mattered in the end, and whether Roosevelt's error in trying to win Stalin's trust would have led to a different outcome had he, for example, not done that.
Another person who witnessed this was Hugh Lungi, Churchill's translator at Tehran. He wrote this in the finest hour. Roosevelt sought to ingratiate himself with Stalin by mocking his British ally. But he did tell Churchill beforehand that he was going to make a few jokes at his expense just to put Stalin at ease. During the conference meetings and social occasion, I observed Roosevelt assuming a jocular air about Churchill's cigar and imperialistic outlook. To me, Stalin at first seemed puzzled by the disunity between the Americans and British, but then he allowed his normally serious face a rare smile. There is no doubt that Roosevelt engaged in teasing Churchill at Tehran. Churchill was after all trying to push Roosevelt and Stalin into things that, in their view, could not and should not be done. This is the nature of negotiations. But a separate question is whether the teasing was necessary or not. Mary Stones, Churchill's daughter, later said, "When I think of Papa and the President, I think of the French proverb. In love there is always one who kisses and one who turns the cheek. And Papa was always kissing and the President was always turning the cheek. Papa was very hurt by it." Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, just 18 days before Hitler shot himself in the bunker. The new US President, Harry Truman, was more aligned with Churchill's views on communism. Even though Churchill lost his position as Prime Minister in July 1945, Truman continued to work with him on Soviet matters. In March 1946 he invited him to give the famous speech known as the Iron Curtain speech, where he encouraged the West to close itself and its satellites from open contact with the Soviet Union. Some say that if Roosevelt wouldn't have died so early after the war, the Cold War probably would have been avoided. Although in his last letter to Stalin, Roosevelt expressed worries about some of Stalin's actions in Europe, and that Stalin wasn't keeping all of his promises. There is a link to Roosevelt's letter to Stalin in the description, among other links to articles about the Tehran Conference and the social dynamics at play in those meetings.